My sister and I came home early to hear my girlfriend coaching her sister. Want to know how I got my boyfriend's uncle to pay for my MBA? My sister grabbed my arm, stopping me in the hallway. Through the doorway, we could hear my girlfriend talking to her younger sister. Uncle Robert refused to pay for my college, she said, so I fixed that. Her sister asked how. Easy. I coached Katie on what to say happened at that Christmas party. My blood went cold. Katie was her cousin. She was 6 years old back then. Look, I documented everything, my girlfriend said, pulling out her phone. Here's the coaching text I wrote out for Katie. It happened during hide and seek in the closet. Point to the doll's privates when they ask where. She scrolled more. I wrote her entire testimony. He said it was a special game. He touched my underwear. She then chuckled like she was proud of herself. 6-year-olds don't talk like that naturally. You have to practice it with them over and over until they believe it themselves. Her sister looked sick. You brainwashed Katie? Successfully. Look at this. She then pulled something up on her phone. Wire transfer. $200,000 from Robert Wade. She chuckled like she was proud of herself. This is how you know you did a good job. Look at Katie's therapy intake from last month. Patient 14, self-hurts due to childhood trauma. She laughed again. Perfect victim. Her whole personality formed around something that never happened. That trauma bought our house and my MBA. I burst through the door, and my sister followed behind, tucking her police badge in her pocket that my girlfriend knew nothing about. You destroyed my uncle's life with a lie? I snapped. My girlfriend spun around, face draining of color. How long have you— Robert took his life. The words came out cold and steady. 2 years ago. Left a note saying he couldn't live with everyone thinking he was a creeper. I didn't know he would what? Only suffer forever instead of dying? I stepped closer, watching her back against the wall. His daughter believed you. She's the one who told him to stay away from her kids. He never met his grandchildren because his own daughter thought he was dangerous. My girlfriend's hands started shaking. That's not my fault. You literally created the lie that killed him. My sister stepped into view, her presence making my girlfriend shrink further. Your cousin Katie harms herself, and you're proud of that? My girlfriend went even paler. My family tore itself apart, I said. My Aunt Linda still sends Robert's widow apology letters for defending him. My Uncle James won't speak to her for not defending him. Cousins choosing sides at every holiday. You know what my grandmother's last words were? At least Robert can't hurt any more children. She died believing her son was a monster. I was young. I didn't think— My girlfriend tried. You were 22 with a spreadsheet of lies. I cut her off. You just showed us the text where you coached a kindergartner. The youth center, I continued, watching her sink into a chair. 400 kids lost their after-school program when Robert's reputation destroyed it. The Sewers Lied hotline he funded shut down. How many kids didn't get help because you wanted tuition money? She was visibly trembling now. It was just supposed to be money. From a man whose reputation you destroyed. My mother hasn't slept through the night in 4 years. She defended her brother-in-law and lost her entire book club, her church friends. They called her an enabler. My sister added quietly, the forensic interview videos of Katie are evidence. A 6-year-old describing assault you invented. That's federal. My girlfriend looked desperately between us. You can't prove— You just showed my sister your proof, I said. The texts coaching Katie, the bank transfers, the lawyer's emails. You documented your own crimes. The proposal, I laughed bitterly. You let me propose in the house Robert paid for, with a ring his death bought, while visiting his grave to pay respects. You watched me cry at his headstone knowing you killed him. His son Marcus dropped out of MIT to support his mom, I continued. She gave Robert everything in the divorce to protect their kids from the molester. 3 jobs at 60 years old because of your lies. My girlfriend was sobbing now, looking so small. Please what? Don't tell Katie her entire trauma is fiction. Don't tell Robert's family he died innocent. Don't report the federal crime you just confessed to. My girlfriend stood to leave, legs shaking. I need to go. Sit down, my sister said quietly, pulling out her phone. The police academy graduation photo on the hallway table suddenly made sense to my girlfriend. You're a cop? Her voice cracked. Detective Wade. Graduated last week. My sister's voice was steady. Everything you just said about coaching Katie, the extortion, the wire fraud, all recorded. But he said you got a new job in sales. I never said sales. You never asked. I stepped back. You made a 6-year-old believe she was molested. You drove an innocent man to Sewers Lied. My sister was already dialing. Katie's about to learn her whole trauma was a lie. Robert's family is about to learn he died innocent. And you're about to learn what real consequences feel like. But there was something we didn't know about Kimberly, and it's that people like her always have a plan B. Kimberly's face went from pale to ghost white when she realized what my sister being a cop meant for her, and she started backing toward the door real fast while mumbling something about needing to leave right now to take care of something important. My sister moved quick and blocked the doorway with her body, telling Kimberly she needed to stay put while we sorted this whole mess out properly. Kimberly's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for another exit, but there wasn't one. My sister pulled out her phone and started recording, explaining to Kimberly that this was now a formal matter that needed proper documentation for the investigation. She pointed at me and told me to sit down on the couch and not touch anything while she called her supervisor to report what just happened. I watched Kimberly's hands shake as she realized how bad this was getting for her. Without warning, Kimberly lunged across the room for her own phone sitting on the coffee table, but I was closer and grabbed it first, holding it up high away from her reach. She started crying hard and begging me to give it back, saying she needed to delete something important right now before it was too late. My sister took the phone from my hand and told Kimberly it was evidence now, and she needed to stop trying to destroy anything, or it would only make things worse for her. She dialed her supervisor while keeping one eye on Kimberly, explaining she needed backup at our location because of a confession involving a federal crime against a minor. Kaylee, who had been frozen in the corner this whole time, looked like she might throw up as she whispered that Kimberly had told her about a backup plan if she ever got caught for this. She said there was something scheduled to send automatically from Kimberly's computer if she didn't stop it in time, something that would hurt more people. I couldn't hold back anymore and told them what they didn't know yet, that Robert had taken his own life 2 years ago, that he left a note saying he couldn't live with everyone believing he hurt a child when he never did. Kimberly stumbled backward into a chair like I'd punched her in the stomach, her hands shaking worse now as the reality of what she'd caused finally hit her. My sister kept her professional composure, but I could see her jaw clenching tight as she told Kimberly to remain seated and not to delete anything from any device she had access to. She stepped into the hall hallway to make another call, but stayed where she could see us through the doorway, probably calling for more backup or maybe the district attorney's office. Kimberly tried to stand up again, her voice getting louder as she said she had rights and didn't have to stay here without a lawyer present. My sister came back into the room and calmly explained that while she wasn't under arrest yet, leaving would be extremely unwise given what she'd just confessed to on a recording. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to my cousin, who lived near Robert's widow, asking them to go check on her before any of this became public knowledge through social media or gossip. I knew she deserved to hear the truth about her husband, but not through some random post or text message from a stranger. About 45 minutes later, 2 detectives in plain clothes showed up at the house, and my sister formally recused herself from the investigation, but explained she would stay as a witness to what happened. They asked Kimberly if she would consent to them securing her phone as evidence, and after they explained the alternative involved getting a warrant which would take longer and look worse for her, she reluctantly agreed. The detectives put on gloves and carefully placed Kimberly's phone in an evidence bag, while one of them started taking our statements about what we'd heard and seen. Kimberly's face drained of all remaining color as she watched them handle the phone that she knew contained all the proof of her crimes against Robert and Katie. Kaylee pulled me aside while the detectives were talking to Kimberly and whispered that her sister had mentioned something about emails set to send to our whole family if she didn't log in every few days. She said the emails would claim I forced Kimberly to make up the whole story about Robert, that I was the real villain here trying to protect a child molester in the family. Her voice shook as she admitted she was terrified of what else her sister might have planned as insurance against getting caught. My phone started ringing, and it was my mother, crying because she'd just heard from another relative that something was happening with Robert's case and the police were involved. I told her I couldn't explain everything yet, but that Robert was innocent. We had proof now, and everything was going to come out soon. What a shocking turn of events. My heart is racing as Kimberly's evil plan comes crashing down around her. The way she coached little Katie with those awful lies makes me so angry, but seeing her finally face justice is incredible. The detectives conducted a preliminary interview with Kimberly right there in our living room, where she admitted to coaching Katie but kept claiming she never meant for Robert to kill himself, that it wasn't supposed to go that far. Her voice cracked as she insisted she was just desperate for money to pay for school and didn't think about all the consequences that would follow. Kaylee stepped forward and told the detectives about how their family had been struggling with money for years after their dad lost his job at the factory. She explained that Kimberly saw Robert's big house and fancy cars and started talking about how unfair it was that some people had so much while they had nothing. The detective taking notes looked up when Kaylee mentioned that Kimberly had researched false accusation cases online for months before picking Katie as the perfect victim. She showed them screenshots from Kimberly's search history that she'd saved on her own phone, searches like coaching child testimony and how to make accusations stick, dated 6 months before the Christmas party. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the evidence, admitting she knew something was wrong when Kimberly started practicing stories with Katie, but was too scared to speak up. The detectives spent another 2 hours going through everything, asking follow-up questions and taking photos of documents on Kaylee's phone. Finally, around midnight, they told Kimberly she was free to go pending further investigation, but couldn't leave town and should expect charges soon. They handed her a paper with instructions about not contacting witnesses or destroying evidence. Kimberly's face was completely blank as she pulled out her phone and called someone for a ride, and I heard her tell them she needed a lawyer right away, a good one who handled federal cases. The detectives packed up their evidence bags and recording equipment while my sister stayed behind to make sure everything was documented properly. The next morning, my sister sat at her desk filling out her official report, being careful to note her recusal from the active investigation while documenting everything she'd witnessed as a civilian. She told me the case looked solid, based on the evidence, but warned this would be a long process with no guarantees since these kinds of cases were complicated. Her phone rang, and it was Jake Bernard from the district attorney's office, asking for all the preliminary documentation from the confession. She put him on speaker, and he sounded interested but cautious, explaining they needed to build an airtight case given how sensitive false accusation cases were. He asked detailed questions about the recording quality and whether Kimberly had been read her rights, seeming satisfied when my sister explained she wasn't in custody at the time of the confession. After the call, I picked up my phone to call Marcus, Robert's son, but when I got his voicemail I just hung up because I didn't know how to explain this in a message. The weight of having to tell him his father died innocent felt crushing, knowing it would open up all those old wounds about the suicide. I kept picking up the phone and putting it down, writing and deleting texts, not knowing how to start that conversation. Meanwhile, Kaylee was going through Kimberly's room while she was gone and found more evidence hidden in a shoebox under the bed. She texted me photos of handwritten notes where Kimberly had practiced Katie's testimony, complete with corrections and arrows showing which words to emphasize. There were also printed articles about similar cases, with parts highlighted about how to avoid getting caught. Kaylee was terrified her sister would try to get back at her for talking to the police, so she decided to send everything to an anonymous tip line the detectives had mentioned. She took photos of all the planning documents, the practice scripts, and even a timeline Kimberly had made showing when to coach Katie for maximum impact. She included details about the coaching sessions she'd personally witnessed, times when Kimberly would sit with Katie for hours going over the story until the little girl could tell it perfectly. The tip line confirmed they received everything and would forward it to the investigators working the case. 2 days later, the detectives called my sister to update her on the case, even though she was officially recused, and she put them on speaker so I could hear that they'd gotten a judge to sign off on a subpoena for Kimberly's bank records. They explained that financial crimes like this always leave a paper trail that's basically impossible to hide once you start looking for it, and the wire transfer would show exactly when and how Robert sent that money. My sister took notes while they talked about how these cases work, how the money moving from one account to another creates records at multiple banks that all have to match up. The next morning, Jake Bernard from the district attorney's office came by to review all the evidence with my sister, and even though she couldn't work the case directly, he wanted her input on what she'd witnessed. He spread out copies of the texts, the bank transfer screenshot, and transcripts clips of the recording across our dining room table, pointing at each piece as he explained the charges he was considering. Wire fraud was the big one, since the money crossed state lines when it went from Robert's credit union to Kimberly's bank, and that made it federal, which meant serious prison time. He also mentioned extortion, since she basically blackmailed Robert with the false accusations, and conspiracy involving a minor because she used Katie to commit the crimes. My sister asked about the recording and whether it would hold up in court, and Jake seemed confident it would, since Kimberly wasn't in custody when she confessed, and nobody forced her to talk. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my room playing the recording of Kimberly's confession on my phone, listening to her laugh about destroying Robert's life like it was some clever joke. My hands started shaking, and I wanted to throw my phone against the wall so bad I could feel my arm tensing up, but I forced myself to put it down and take deep breaths, because getting angry wouldn't help Robert now. The only thing that might honor his memory was making sure justice actually happened this time. The next day, Jake's office sent out a memo to everyone involved in the case about their media strategy, which basically meant nobody was supposed to talk to reporters or post anything online about what was happening. He explained during a conference call that once this became public, everyone would have opinions, and the last thing they needed was potential jurors seeing a bunch of stuff on social media that could mess up the trial. Meanwhile, the detectives were working on the Katie situation, trying to figure out how to handle her involvement without making things worse for a kid who already believed she'd been hurt. They reached out through official channels to the therapist, who'd been treating Katie for her trauma, explaining they needed to discuss her patient, but being careful not to reveal too much over the phone. The therapist agreed to meet with them in person, and from what my sister heard later, she was shocked, but also worried about how Katie would handle learning the truth. A week passed before we heard that Kimberly had hired a defense attorney, who immediately started filing motions to get evidence thrown out. The big one was challenging the recording of her confession, arguing that my sister should have read her Miranda rights before recording anything, since she was a cop. Jake called us right after the motion was filed, and he didn't sound worried at all, explaining that Miranda only applies when someone's in custody and being interrogated by police, since Kimberly was in her own home talking freely to people she knew personally, and my sister wasn't there in an official capacity. The recording should be fine. That same afternoon, Kaylee showed up at my door looking scared and asked if we could talk privately. She pulled me into the backyard and whispered that Kimberly had told her about a backup plan months ago, something about emails that were set to send automatically if anything ever happened to her. According to Kaylee, these emails would go to my whole family, my job, and even the police, claiming that I forced Kimberly to make up the story about Robert and threatened her if she didn't go along with it. Kaylee knew where Kimberly kept her laptop password, written down in a notebook, and she thought maybe we could stop the emails before they sent. I immediately called the detectives and told them everything Kaylee had just told me, and they took it seriously, getting a warrant that same day to access Kimberly's cloud storage and email accounts. The tech team worked through the night and found the scheduled emails exactly where Kaylee said they'd be, set to send in 3 days if Kimberly didn't log in to cancel them. They documented everything, taking screenshots of each email and the scheduling settings, then canceled them all while making sure to preserve the evidence of what she'd tried to do. Jake later told us this was huge because it showed consciousness of guilt and an attempt to obstruct justice by framing me for her crimes. About 2 weeks after the investigation started, the bank records finally came back from the subpoena, and they confirmed everything. The wire transfer of exactly $200,000 went from Robert's account to Kimberly's just 2 months before he killed himself. And the paper trail showed she used it for the down payment on the house we'd been living in, and her MBA tuition, just like she'd bragged about. The records even showed Robert had to take out a loan against his retirement to get the money, which made it even worse knowing he destroyed his future for a lie. I knew I had to tell Robert's widow before she heard it from someone else or saw it in the news, so I drove to her apartment that evening with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. This evidence pile is growing huge. Kimberly wrote practice scripts for Katie and made a whole timeline. She planned this for months, plus those backup emails trying to frame the narrator show she knew she might get caught. She answered the door looking tired from another long shift at one of her 3 jobs, and when she saw my face, she knew something big had happened. We sat at her small kitchen table, and I told her everything, watching her face change from confusion to shock to this deep sadness as she processed that her husband had died innocent. She started crying and asked me why Katie would say those things if they weren't true, and I had to explain how Kimberly coached her, how a 6-year-old can be taught to believe something that never happened. She held my hand across the table for a long moment before asking if the police knew about all this, and I told her they did, and that Jake Bernard from the district attorney's office was handling it personally. The next morning, Jake called Kaylee in for a formal interview at the courthouse downtown, where she spent 3 hours going through everything she'd witnessed. She showed him dates in her calendar app where she'd marked when Kimberly made her practice with Katie, and she remembered specific phrases Kimberly used, like telling Katie to say it tickled when they asked how it felt. Jake took notes on everything and had Kaylee sign a sworn statement that matched up perfectly with the coaching text we'd already recovered from Kimberly's phone. 2 days later, a woman named Sylvia Laurent joined the investigation team as a specialist in false memory cases involving children. She sat down with Jake and my sister to explain that Katie genuinely believed these memories were real now because young brains can't always tell the difference between something that happened and something they were taught happened. She stressed that we couldn't just tell Katie the truth all at once because it could cause serious psychological damage to suddenly learn her entire identity as a trauma survivor was based on a lie. Jake pulled up the original forensic interview videos from 8 years ago when Katie was 6 and we all watched them together in his office. The interviewer asked Katie to describe what happened, and she used words like inappropriate touching and private areas that no 6-year-old would naturally say without being coached. Jake shook his head and pointed out how Katie kept looking off camera, like she was checking if she was saying it right, and you could see her counting on her fingers when she listed the 3 times it supposedly happened. The language matched Kimberly's coaching text word for word in some places, especially when Katie said, "He told me it was our special secret," which was exactly what Kimberly had written in her notes. That afternoon, we got word that